Hey guys, it's Mathel here once again, and I have one question for you. Are you ready to fucking fall asleep? Because I'm gonna talk about patch changes and the patch notes and the tree changes, mostly the Ascendancies, for about 30 minutes to an hour. I don't know, see how long it takes. But I'm gonna get through basically patch changes, patch notes, and all that. And not quite patch notes, but their development manifesto. Patch notes are coming next week, as they say, and just give my sort of opinion on what's happening and the important changes, at least the way I see it and the way I play the game. So let's get started. This is the Development Manifesto 2.3.0 balance, and it just goes over some of the changes. The full patch notes will be released next week for us to look over, so let's not jump to too many conclusions just yet, but we can get a decent overview of what's coming in Prophecy. So to start with, the first major change is to trap damage and the way it is calculated towards the way you take damage as a life or energy shield character. Previously, the total of a player's maximum life and energy shield is what it was. Now energy shield counts as 60% of its value for this purpose, rather than just adding entirely onto the total. So it says only energy shield covering life is counted, and that's the best ratio they went for, meaning it's going to be slightly easier for your low life and your CI characters to run lab, because you won't take as much damage as you previously did, which is a nice little change. Next up is Chaos Conversion. Now, this has been known ever since the podcast, but the Chaos Conversion has been reduced in effectiveness. As it says, it only appears in a few items because there's only a few items that have this, and that is Voltaxic, Infernal Mantle, and Consuming Dark. They've been reduced to 60% of their original value. So that means Voltaxic, instead of converting 100%, now does 60%. Consuming Dark, instead of converting 50, now does 30. And Infernal Mantle, instead of 25, now does 15. Now, it hits Infernal Mantle the hardest, I think, because it was already kind of halfway there. But it's still usable, and essentially if you want to use Chaos Conversion for the Fire type builds like you did before with Consuming Darks, you're probably going to have to go all out and use 2 Consuming Darks and the Infernal Mantle, and that will bring you up to 75%. Yeah. So that still won't quite give you 100% Chaos, but 75% is still good, and that's good enough to do most of the Chaos Conversion builds that you could do before. It's just a bit harder to build around, but that's okay. I think that's still fine. And Voltaxic now does 60% of its Chaos Conversion, meaning 40% of your damage will still be lightning, which isn't that big a deal. If you look at my lightning arrow frostwall sort of build, you have a vast overkill of damage. And Reflect is no longer really a problem anyway, because, well, we have Valpact, and 60% of your damage is still going to be Chaos, so essentially you might hurt yourself a fair bit on minus max Ellie Reflect maps, but I think you'd still be able to get by with the amount of leech and the Valpact you have to not really care about this change too much at all. The biggest difference this would be is for people that use poison in their Voltaxic setups. That's going to be kind of an issue, because then you have 40% less damage to scale your poison on as well, and that's kind of rough. My build doesn't use that, but also the Sparkers might get hurt a bit in this whole conversion, because it's a bit different to Lightning Arrow in the way it works. I think ultimately Voltaxic builds are still going to be good. It's just if you're going to need to do them anymore based off of some of the other changes. Next up is monsters and maps with the hexproof prefix now grant the hexproof keyword. Essentially what's going to happen here is hexproof prevents curses applying to monsters, but can be bypassed under certain conditions. So maps and curse immune monsters are now going to be hexproof, meaning they can actually be bypassed with certain things like a new item that's coming into the game. And they then leave up to them to have actual pure curse immunities in the future, but at this stage it's mostly just going to help you bypass the curse from monsters, and the map mod. And they say they have one item in place so far, but there may be more in the future. Now, the item in question was released here, and it is Cosbree's Will, an Assassin's Garb. Has a bunch of evasion, bit of chaos resist. Enemies can have one additional curse, that's pretty fucking good. And your curses can apply to hexproof enemies. As well as that, poison cursed enemies on hit. So that's going to be a free way to poison enemies if you run a blasphemy, and you absolutely will if you're wearing this thing. On top of that, you get a second curse. So now you have 2. That's pretty goddamn huge. And curse immune maps and monsters no longer screw you in any way, shape, or form. So this is a really strong chest, and going to be quite desirable on a lot of builds. Yeah, maybe it's really rare, so who knows. But that is a pretty insane item, and the ability to roll over curse immune maps, roll through them, is just really strong. But they say there may be more items like that in the future. Furthermore, they've made changes to taunts and how they're treated in the game. That doesn't really affect me, I barely ever use taunts anyway. But it says taunted targets now have an effect, so there's a little swirly red thing around enemies that are actually taunted to indicate they're taunted. Enemies you taunt do 10% less damage to targets that aren't you, including in PvP. So if you do actually have some taunt-based shit, it's kinda useful now, but ultimately this isn't the kind of game where you get tanks and try and avoid other people getting taken damage. So I don't know, doesn't seem that useful to me all in all. Now we move on to some item balance. Unique jewels now have a separate sequence of rarities within the unique items. Unique jewels will now have 3 tiers of rarity, all of which are rarer than the normal base rarity tier. Additionally, 4th tier chase unique items like Shavron's wrappings have been made rarer than they were in 2.2.0. So we don't know what other 4th tier items we're talking here, but a Shavs, for example, is going to be rarer than it was before. And paired with the fact that it won't be Perandus anymore, so Kadiro won't be selling these things, Shavs is going to be quite a bit more expensive once again. Probably closer to what it used to be. Because low life builds are still really strong nowadays. And Shavs are a pretty desirable item. Now this may be seen as somewhat of a bad change because a lot of people were pretty hyped to have common, super good uniques. But ultimately, I think it's probably better for the game to have more, at least a few more of those items that you have to strive towards, to build towards as a goal, and to be, just more expensive. So you actually find drops that you still get excited over and have a big payout off of, because at the moment there's like 2, your Skyforths and a mirror. I don't know, or just chancing some items from previous maps. Otherwise, there's really not that much payoff from the really big items to find. So that's not too bad, I think. Next, weapons that can roll both caster and attack mods. So we're talking like staves, daggers, wands, scepters, all of that shit that could previously roll attack mods, caster mods, now have more propensity to stay caster or stay attack. So as it says, when these items only have caster or attack mods, they are less likely to get mods of the other type. So if you're crafting a fizz weapon for your staff fizz character, and you have a few fizz rolls on there, it's going to be a lot easier to then get more fizz rolls. Or it says a subtle change, so you see it on hybrid items, just fewer than previously. So it's supposedly not too noticeable, but it should help at least, because previously making staves, daggers, wands, that shit is actually really challenging. You have to be really lucky to get it to happen. Next up, the implicits on scepters and wands were increased in value. So we're talking wands, they say, go up to 42% spell damage, and scepters will go up to 40% elemental damage. That's pretty good. It's roughly double for most of those mods. And that's nice and useful, but ultimately if they don't change anything to Whirling Blades, that doesn't really change anything. Having a few extra percent and making your caster weapons easier to roll isn't going to stop you from wanting to use daggers and consequently Whirling Blades with Fortify on your caster builds. It is way better than just having a bit of extra damage from your scepters or your wands. So time will tell to see if they change anything with Whirling Blades. If they don't, that's not really going to change too much, to be honest. Now we're down to skill changes. Ancestor totems, so we're talking like melee totem things that you place, now emerge 40% faster, have 50% more totem life, and remain active 40% further away from the owner. These are all pretty good changes. I kind of like those totems myself in melee builds. They serve their own niche little purpose as just a buff stick and a bit of extra damage and all that. And all these changes are pretty good for it, especially the 40% further away, because if you run like half a screen away from the thing, it kind of goes down and doesn't attack anymore. 40% further away should probably mean you can move almost a full screen away and have that totem still attack. So that's not a bad change at all. Enfeeble copped a bit of a nerf, which doesn't really matter by the looks of it. It says now causes monsters to lose 21% crit multi at level 1, down from 40%, and it goes all the way up to 30% at level 20. Monsters only go up to 30% crit multi, so at level 20 you're still cancelling it out completely. It just means that now if you roll a map mod that has extra crit and crit multi, it will actually affect the monsters more. That's fine, I think. Enfeeble's pretty goddamn strong anyway, so that's okay. Pretty huge change here. Shield Charge is now an area of effect skill. It deals damage to enemies you collide with as you charge. So while you're charging, you're actually going to be hitting things now. And then it deals a large AoE at the end of the charge. So you're charging through a bunch of monsters, actually fucking hitting them now. You hit your destination, boom, big explosion of AoE. It no longer always stuns, it gains more damage and stun threshold reduction the further you travel up to a certain distance. This means I think you can actually see some shield charge builds now. Depends on how the scaling still works, how the AoE looks while charging, and how the AoE looks at the end of the charge, but this could actually be a full viable skill and very fun thing to play. I'm looking forward to trying that out. The cast time, Ice Nova and Val Ice Nova changed from 900 to 800 ms. Small quality of life improvement, no one cares. And Wallard's Mark now has 10% chance to stun rather than 15% at all levels. That's okay, it just means you can't perma-stun anymore when stacking everything, supposedly. Something I never did, and most of us never did anyway. Support changes, all support gems now support part of their name, great. Ellie Prolif, after taking years of beatings of nerfs, buffs, whatever, now going from 12 radius in units up to 16, that probably makes it usable. At least a lot more than it used to be. 12 was really small, 16's a much better number. It used to be 20 at one point, and that's when it was really flavor of the month. 16's okay though. I think ultimately Elementalist is probably still the way to go because it now has 12 radius, and it's just a free Prolif on top of everything. Whereas Early Prolif is still going to have to use a gem for that entire thing. Not sure it's going to be worth it in most builds, but at least it's a lot more usable now. Spell Totem Support now has a smaller damage penalty. At level 1 it went from 50% less to 35% less, and at level 20 it goes from 31% less to 26% less. That's pretty good change, makes it a lot more usable for Spell Totem and spells attached to that. I think you're going to see more of a rise in, well, let's say your Bladefall totems. Those things are pretty insane. Maybe something stupid like Arc Totems, Spork, I don't know. Other such things. Makes it a lot more usable. I think Bladefall totems probably going to be the most popular use out of that. Monster and map balance. Cruel, Merciless, and map content requires various rebalances. Rather than apply buffs to life and damage, they've instead added new skills, higher difficulties for new monsters, and applied various correction-specific monster skills. So you can read through this yourself, but they've basically added like an extra type of monster in quite a lot of areas. and they have an extra skill. So one will use, I don't know, breathes fire, gets enraged, blast range, spectral throw, magma orb. Spectral throw monsters in general in this game are pretty strong, so you wouldn't want to get hit by that as a side note. And they can also spawn in maps, and they've been randomly inserted in there. Some other things got changed as far as monsters. Nothing too significant going on here. Gain a bit more experience from Goliaths and Chimeras because they suck, so that's fine. Lowered some life monsters which appeared solo in the core game but can appear as packs in maps. Not really even sure what that means. General buffs to spells cast by monsters. That's fine. They're pretty weak in general, just like spells that any monsters cast while mapping. So a slight buff there isn't a big deal. Graveyard Merveil got a bit easier. Don't think that was really necessary. And Necro Merveil got a bit harder, just that first phase. Also, doesn't really matter. As far as other things go, they removed Village Ruin from Zana. That's pretty cool. It means you don't have to deal with the shitty bosses anymore on some characters. That was pretty bad. They added Canyon and Plateau on Zana. That's awesome. They added the Wolfpack Den Care Blade unique map. Don't really care about that. New endgame map, Plaza map, currently a tier 14, and has a standalone version of Goddess of Justice as the boss encounter. So that sounds pretty cool. That's a good, probably good boss encounter to look forward to. And they've adjusted some experience penalty and whatever leveling areas as they test more values. That's to be seen. Now, some shit change here. They added a new boss, Kauru, to the caverns in Act 2. It's a Val plummeting Ursa, so a drop bear. Uses Earthquake and rages. That sounds lame. No one likes drop bears. Cruel Zara got a slight nerf. Life reduced by 20%, damage reduced by about 10 to 15% throughout the board. And that's fine. Usually you'd over level Cruel because Zara was kind of a challenge as you'd get to him while leveling. So that's perfectly fine, and I think no problems there. Passive tree and Ascendancy changes. So they did make a bunch of changes to actual Ascendancies and Ascendancy related passives, and also one change to the actual passive tree itself, which is making Arcane Vision a lot more accessible for Pain Attunement builds. So we'll jump straight into passive tree discussion and changes and what that all means. So as far as Pain Attunement goes and Arcane Vision, it now sits over here, meaning it only takes 1 point to get whenever you need it for your build. Used to sit up here, which would waste 3 points at a minimum, usually, sometimes 4. So now you only have to use 1 point. That's just a nice little quality of life change. The bulk of the changes to passive trees were done to Ascendancies and Ascendancy passives. I'll go over them now, what was changed and what they mean to me in particular. I will miss some of them because I don't really play a lot of the Ascendancies and I'm not quite sure what it's going to mean to a lot of classes, but this is what I see. And these are the changes that make a difference to me. Starting off with the Scion, and the single most important change here is they've killed the Scion, because Berserker, while it used to do 1.5% damage leached as life, so all types of damage, 1.5% leached, it now only does 1% of damage leached as life if you've killed recently. Which just isn't reliable enough to care about, because you need it for boss fights, you need it for packs that are in between other packs, and it's just, I don't like the whole recently thing. It kind of is a bit janky. So yeah. The number one reason for Scion to be taken was to use the Berserker for leech, which was arguably too strong, but this basically kills it for me, and I probably won't ever be making one of these ever again. So that's the biggest change there. Another change is they've added Culling Strike to the Slayer node. So that's just basically a 10% damage gain. Somewhat useful. Nothing else changed there. Deadeye went from 50% Proj Pierce to 30%. It's a little bit of a kick in the nuts, but it's still a fairly strong Ascendancy there as far as Scion goes. And also 15% chance to cause bleeding on hit with attacks, which, I don't know, it's neither here nor there, doesn't really do too much. Besides that, I don't think there's really any other substantial changes to the Scion. Most importantly, yeah, the biggest reason to play it got nerfed hard. And that brings us to Berserker, because as we all knew, Scion Berserker was basically better than this Berserker thanks to that leech. No more. Nothing changed over here, and over here, and not sure anything really changed over here. Warbringer used to recover 10% of life when used a Warcry, now it recovers 25%. That's pretty substantial, but still not really too useful. The big change is Pain Reaver. 1% of damage leeches life, 1% of damage leeches mana, and 2% damage leeches mana and life if you've killed recently. That's huge. This opens up a whole world of possibilities of pretty much everything Berserker. You can play spellcasters, you can play elemental builds. Spellcasters getting 1% damage leeches mana is massive. On top of that, you're always going to be grabbing your, aspect of Carnage, which is 40% more damage. So essentially you can be grabbing 40% more damage, and then 1% damage leeches life and mana. And then when you killed recently, which is a fair amount of the time, when you already have a base amount of leech, that's actually quite fucking useful. And the last two Ascendancies, so for 8 points, I don't see too much exciting stuff. You'd probably take this. The other difference is a Savage hit is now 15% of maximum life. So when you take 15% of maximum life, that constitutes a Savage hit, and you'll get these sexy buffs. So that's probably what you take as well. Makes Savage hit a bit more viable than it used to be. The take-home note, Pain Reaver, pretty goddamn amazing, and you can build quite a lot of versatile Berserkers now. Moving on to Juggernaut, nothing really changed there. This used to be 10% attack speed, it's now still 10% attack speed, but the chance to get more if you get more accuracy. It's a pretty small change, not that big a deal. Nothing changed there. I think you gain 25% effective Fortify here, so that makes Juggernaut a potential even more of a tank. I think it was already the tankiest class out there, but now that you Fortify, can be another, 5% stronger. That's pretty solid. Nothing really changed here. Big change is here, which says if you would gain endurance charges, you instead gain up to your maximum number of endurance charges. Now, what this means to me, although it's a little unclear, is anytime you'd gain an endurance charge from whatever you're gaining it, let's say Enduring Cry, you Enduring Cry one monster, you'd gain 1 endurance charge. This instead gives you your maximum. If your maximum is 8, all of a sudden you're getting 8 from 1 Enduring Cry. Or 20% chance to gain endurance charge when you are hit. If you get hit and gain 1 endurance charge, you're instead now gaining 8. If you have up to 8, that is. So that makes some pretty interesting things with Discharge, I suppose. Immortal Call, cast when damage taken Immortal Calls, all that sort of shit. Yeah, that's actually a pretty solid passive now. And Juggernaut becomes even more of a tank than he used to be, but maybe some other viable things pop up with Unrelenting. Chieftain, I never really touched it. I don't really know if anything's changed. Yeah, I have no idea. Never really played it. Whatever. Inquisitor. Nothing really changed here. I think this went up to 8 seconds instead of 4 seconds. Still doesn't really bother me. Doesn't really matter. What did get changed is Augur of Penitence went up from 10% damage taken to 16, so that's a 6% damage gain on all your skills. Just a flat 6% across the board, and they also deal a bit less damage. I think it used to be like 4%, 6, I don't know, whatever. It's a buff. The other buff is Instruments of Virtue. So you now get a lot more spell damage, attack speed, and cast speed after doing things recently. Most importantly, it's probably the increased attack speed if you've attacked recently, meaning you now have an extra 10% when whirling blading as opposed to before. That's a pretty large amount of extra whirling blade attack speed. So I thought Inquisitor might take some nerfs since it is really strong for any elemental crit builds. But no, just got a few small buffs. Great. Both Hierophant and Guardian had a few changes and a few buffs. I haven't really paid too much attention to either of these classes. I could maybe have a look and tell you if I know what's going on. There was one thing that we noticed. What are we looking at? Sanctuary of Thought, 50% reduced mana cost of skills, 50% reduced mana cost of skills while on full energy shield. Those things are actually pretty good. It's going to be at least always 50% reduced mana cost of skills, which is fairly substantial, especially if you're using some of the heavier cost mana skills. I don't know, like a Blade Vortex, or some other dumb shit like Elemental Hit. I don't know. Point is, yeah, that's not too bad. I really don't know much about these two classes. I don't look at them, nor do I have much intention of playing them. Unfortunately, you'll have to go somewhere else for that. Cultist, I believe there's a fairly minor amount of changes here. I think this now does some chaos damage where it previously didn't. I might be wrong on that. I think Profane Bloom went from 10% damage dealt as chaos to a quarter of the life. Don't quote me on that, but I think it went up to a quarter, which makes it pretty damn good because people could scale it well enough at 10% before. Now you can scale it to even better numbers. The Profane Bloom could be really useful here, since it scales with chaos damage. Nothing changed over here, however. Elementalist, Liege of Primordial is a pretty sweet 2-pointer now. 1 to max number of golems, meaning you can have 2 golems out that gives you mega buffs. 100% effective buffs, 40% increase of each damage type. You can now have like a fire and a ice golem, 2 at once, 2 double buffs, which is pretty big, and for 2 points I think that's very useful. And your golems are immune to elemental damage, so they're pretty goddamn durable. I do like this for 2 points. What else changed? Some duration on elements on enemies. I think that wasn't there before, and some there. Beacon of Ruin went from 9 to 12, so that's pretty useful. Even at 9 it was very useful. Now at 12 it's going to be even better. Paragon of Calamity is a big one. This seems to be the way that GGG are going to take you away from the chaos meta by going to reduced reflected elemental damage taken by 50%, which is quite substantial. It might not be enough to still comfortably run elemental reflect maps, but it should take care of reflect on single monsters very comfortably, even on minus max maps, I would think. So with these 2 points, essentially you're almost always going to be taking like, I don't know, 4 here, probably 2 here, maybe 2 here when you're going for 8. That's going to be very strong. But on top of that, Pendulum of Destruction gives you 25% extra radius of area skills for 4 seconds every 10 seconds. Kind of, I don't know, I don't like unreliable things, so I don't really care about this at all, but it can be useful. And I don't think that's changed at all. Necromancer, I don't think anything's changed here. I'm not too well versed with this Ascendancy anyway. You will probably have to check that out somewhere else. Now we get to Assassin. Nothing changed for the most part. Nothing changed up there. The big difference is Toxic Delivery and Noxious Strike were swapped around. And the big news here is Toxic Delivery was rather changed. So it used to be 10% of fizz damage gained as extra chaos, but it now is 20% against bleeding enemies instead of always up at 10%. But the huge deal is poison you inflict with critical strikes deals 100% more damage, which is a huge amount of extra poison. And bleeding you inflict on maimed enemies deals 100% more damage too, which is a huge amount of extra bleed. Basically, any crit skill that you're Fizz and Chaos and you usually go for poison, you're going to be going Assassin and dealing a shitload more Chaos and poison. And this, I don't know, feels like an oversight, maybe. It's way too strong, I think, in its current form. Your crit Blade Fallers or Blade Vortexes or, I don't fucking know, Reeve, Dagger characters, all kinds of bullshit that you're going to do with poison and fizz is going to have so much extra poison damage, it's going to be pretty ridiculous, I think. Moving on from there. Trickster, this went from 10 to 15. That's a bit more comfortable frenzy charge generation. Don't know if anything else changed. I couldn't see anything else changing. So leaving that alone. Don't know much about Saboteur. I don't think anything special changed here. Not too much of a big deal. Deadeye, there was one major change, I believe. Rupture got changed to actually be more useful overall. Moving while bleeding doesn't cause you to take extra damage is kind of neither here nor there, because you're going to be taking off the bleed with a flask anyway. But there's a couple of little buffs against bleeding enemies. The big change is Powerful Precision, now on top of getting you that extra crit versus pierce monsters, also has attack projectiles return to you after hitting targets. So I've never really tried that out. It's a Torah weapon mod, I think, at level 8. You can craft that on, something like that. I don't know, whatever. Point is, I've never really tried it out, but to my understanding, it doesn't work if you chain, pierce, fork, any of that shit, which you're pretty much always doing with every one of your skills. Essentially, if you throw out, let's say, a projectile, a elemental hit, why not? And it hits something, it's then going to come back to you straight away. If it pierces, it's going to keep going, not going to come back to you, doesn't matter. So I don't know how useful that actually is in application. I may be proven wrong after trying it, or after someone else showcases it to me, but I don't see that being too big a deal. It might be amazing, it might be garbage. Don't really know. Pathfinder. That's actually one I haven't really played, but I have looked at a bit in the past. I think that's received a few changes. 20% chance for your flask to not consume charges can be somewhat substantial, but I think ultimately you're not going to rely on that. It's just kind of one of those things that you might sometimes get some use out of, and I wouldn't really care too much about this node. The big and more important node is Master Alchemist, immune to elemental status ailments during flask effects. That's fairly huge, meaning you now don't get shocked, burned, or frozen, or chilled, whenever you have any of your flasks up. And on top of that, you get 20% chance to freeze, shock, and ignite during flask effect. Yeah, that's a pretty strong passive now. Might be well worth grabbing and actually rolling a Pathfinder for several builds. CI especially comes to mind, because that's something you don't have to worry about for getting frozen ever again on while using any of your flasks. Doesn't matter what flask you're using, any of your unique flasks. It could be pretty damn good. Besides that, did anything else change? Not really. Nothing else too substantial. Enemies you kill that are affected by elemental status ailments grants 100% increased flask charges. Should be pretty much all the time if you're actually relying on your status ailments, and you are as a crit build, and you're playing crit because you play PoE. So 100% increased flask charges, just some good sustain between packs and monsters. So that's pretty decent. Pathfinder, slight buffs I'd say, not too shabby. Raider has one pretty substantial change, I believe. Nothing changed there. Nothing really changed there, except for this going from 10 to 15% chance. Big change is Quartz Infusion. You have phasing while at max frenzy charges, which should be basically always. You also have phasing while you have onslaught, which should be basically always with this shit while mapping or clearing packs. On top of that, you also now, since you have phasing all the time, essentially, you'll also be immune to elemental status ailments while phasing, which is also pretty goddamn strong and synergizes it really well. You also get 20% movement speed while phasing, 10% chance to dodge spells. I don't know, there's a lot to play around with here. It can be a very strong Ascendancy for defensive purposes. Getting these four, probably those four, maybe these four. But yeah, this will be your staple almost 100% of the time when making a raider, I would think. And that may actually prompt me to make a raider at some point. Moving on to the last of the Ascendancies, and potentially the most important. Let's start with Gladiator. Just kidding, I don't really fucking care about either of these. There's a few changes. They more or less nerfed some fortified buff effects, gave you some other things like some attack speed, melee damage, whatever. You check it out yourself, and if you're interested in them, you're interested in them. Big deal, big dick news is the Slayer. Now, why does this matter? Why is the Slayer amazing now? Slayer used to be completely garbage. It is now probably one of the best, if not the best, physical attack melee type character. Reasons for that. So we start off with, no one cares about this. We start off with this. Damage, damage, cool. We then get onto your 2-pointer, Bane of Legends. Gain onslaught for 20 seconds when you kill a rare or unique. So that's quite a long time. That should be up 100% of the time while mapping. Pretty damn nice. Kill enemies that have 20% or lower life when hit. So my understanding of that is when hit means when they're getting hit. So it's a 20% cull, which essentially makes it a 20% damage buff. It's pretty substantial in something like, let's say, Izaro, where that third phase of Izaro, especially in the Uber Labs, you'll only have to do like 10% damage. But in general, 20% on all monsters is huge. Then we move on to Headsman. 50% reduced reflected physical damage taken. 20% more damage if you've killed recently. Now for mapping, that's going to be almost always. And 20% radius of area skills if you've killed recently. Also, pretty much always while you're mapping and killing recently, which you always are. So 50% reduced reflected physical damage taken essentially makes this the best Ascendancy to counteract the effects of Abyssus. To counteract Abyssus, Juggernaut does really well, because it gives you reduced damage taken from monsters and reduced damage taken from Reflect, based on having more armor and all that. But the biggest danger to Abyssus is yourself through Reflect, and this is absolutely huge, 50% damage. On top of that, you get the radius, you get the more damage. That's really good nodes. So basically, you're going to be taking these four no matter what. Right? Right. Next, you have a bit of leech, whatever. 20% of overkill damage is leeched as life. Life leech effects are not removed at full life. So, it doesn't matter how much you are leeching. Like, let's say you overkill for 1 trillion. 20% of overkill damage is leeched as life. So now you're overkill leeching for 200 billion. Let's just say. It says it's not removed at full life. So you're going to keep getting that as you get damaged, which seems really nice, just for general sustain. If you don't have Val Pact, I imagine. Val Pact should be like instant, right? I don't know. Who the fuck knows? We'll play around with it. After that, you have Brutal Fervor, 10% of maximum life per second to maximum life leech rate. It's not too bad. And 100% increased life leech per second. That just makes it a lot closer to Val Pact. Cannot be stunned while leeching, which should be pretty much always, especially with this shit. And you are immune to bleeding while leeching. Not too useful. You're always going to have a bleed flask probably anyway. But maybe you can drop your bleed flask with this. We'll see if that's worth it. Lastly, you have two-handed damage area effect radius, 5% another AoE there. And impact, 15% radius of area skills. Also, you can then use single targets as splash. Basically a gimp to melee splash, or I don't know, maybe similar to melee splash. Point is, you get these four, you get these two, you get those two when you're going for 8. You get 40% extra radius. You'll have 50% reduced reflect damage, 20% more damage most of the time, 20% cull, onslaught all the time. This sounds pretty insane to me. Just mostly for the 40% radius. 40% radius is essentially the entire passive trees of radius right now. These nodes here give you 15, these nodes here give you 15, these nodes here give you 10. In total, that's 40. This saves you from having to get the entire node's worth, passive tree's worth of nodes for AoE, which you normally wouldn't get as a melee character anyway. So Earthquake, if it doesn't get nerfed, is going to be freaking massive on this character. Anyway, I am out of mouth to keep doing this, and I've done all I really need to. I covered basically anything that has affected me that may affect you, I think, and left out a few things for you guys to figure out on your own. Hope that was informative enough. Hope you are having sweet dreams while asleep right now, because there's no way you lost it to the end. And yeah, I'll see you guys in a week for Prophecy. As always, it's going to be huge. And I trust very fun with some of the changes. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time, and have a good day.